Hello, and today we're going to be reviewing the HyperTough 99303 12-volt 3/8 inch brushed drill. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, starting off with the battery and battery compartment, we're going to find that the battery is fairly well engineered here. The battery locks into place nice and securely, and there is next to no looseness or play to speak of, so it's a very good showing. I really can't force the battery to eject itself even when I'm pulling out without pushing on the tabs, and it's been a very good showing in actual work scenarios as well, and I haven't had any sort of issues with the battery falling free as long as you make sure that the battery locks into place securely when you insert the battery. Now, when it comes to runtime, this particular battery is a 1.5 amp hour battery, and that is a fairly small battery. Now, that will be more than good enough for most of your small DIY tasks, such as assembling furniture that you bought from IKEA or making basic repairs around your apartment or RV. But quite frankly, if you have any sort of large project that you're planning and you're planning on using this particular drill, it is highly recommended that you buy a larger battery, say a 4 amp hour or 6 amp hour battery, since they do make both of those particular batteries for the HyperTough lineup. Now, I personally do think that this particular tool does benefit from having multiple batteries at your disposal, and it's fairly easy to accrue batteries in this particular tool line since every single one of their tools will be coming with a battery. So that is the good news with this particular line of tools. At the end of the day, the battery that is included with this particular tool is completely adequate for your basic needs, but upgrading it so that you have more power and a longer runtime will be advisable for large projects. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the grip, and well, quite frankly, it's a pretty good showing, except for a few things that are just my own personal preferences. For me personally, I really do like the overall grip on this particular tool. The rubberized texture feels like it's a nice quality material, and it's very thick, and there are plenty of indentations and patterns that have been molded into it or cut out of it that will help you maintain your grip on this particular tool. What I'm not a huge fan of would just be the overall chunkiness of the grip or the overall circumference. It's a pretty thick grip, and for me personally, I really do like using tools that have a little bit more of a narrow grip, such as on their 8-volt drill that they used to manufacture. And I find myself using the 8-volt drill far more often because I like the grip on that particular tool better. And it's also my go-to drill for small projects, so quite frankly, it's just my own personal preference. Now, the other thing about the grip that I'm not a huge fan of would be the fact that the motor housing is sort of aimed up at a more of a 10 o'clock position rather than the more neutral 9 o'clock position that the previous 8-volt drill came with, or pretty much most drills on the market seem to have their motor housings aimed at. Now, this is more of a personal preference thing than anything else, but for me personally, I do like having the more neutral 9 o'clock position because of muscle memory. But with that being said, it isn't a huge negative, and I can learn to live with this particular change from, well, let's say, the previous generation. So at the end of the day, most of my negatives when it comes to the grip on this particular tool comes down to the personal preference, and it doesn't really affect the overall usability of this particular tool, and I can still use this tool fairly comfortably. So everything here still passes with flying colors. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the trigger, and it's a decent showing for the price, but it's definitely not what I would call a high quality trigger. First of all, it is made out of plastic, and it, well, operates along sort of a plastic track, which means it's very prone to becoming, well, stuck or sticky along the pull, which means that you don't have very precise control over the pull or, you know, just the overall travel of the trigger. So there are going to be the occasional jumps in speed just because of, well, the plastic on plastic. The other thing is the definition between the speeds on this particular motor is going to be closer to what I would describe as staircase or stairs versus a, well, ramp. It has fairly drastic changes when you're pulling the trigger from the different speeds, and there's about 10 to 11 speeds for you to work with. And so that, while that may sound like a lot, if you're working on something that is incredibly delicate or is prone to shattering, this might not be the best option since it was going to, well, transition in between the different speeds quicker. And so this isn't going to be a great option for precise work. Now, the trigger itself is made out of a red plastic and is a single finger trigger, which means that you don't have very much control since you're only going to be using one finger. So yeah, it's definitely not going to be the best option for precise work. So for the price point and considering that, you know, it's a fairly cheap drill, the trigger is very good. But if you're looking to do any sort of precise work or work on delicate objects such as porcelain or glass, there are probably better drills on the market for you to take a look at. But for your average, furniture building, car work, or even, building small things out of plywood or 2x4s, this should be more than adequate. But I would definitely look at something that has a better speed control if you're working with super delicate, building materials. So yeah, trigger's adequate for the price, but not the best in the world. Okay, next up we have the selector switch, and for the most part it's a very good showing. The selector switch itself is made out of plastic, like pretty much all selector switches, and is very easy to access with your thumb as well as your, finger right next to the thumb. So quite frankly, it's a fairly good showing. It's easy to put it into forward reverse, and it's also easy to get into the, locked position. So really no complaints there. If you do pull on the trigger hard enough when it's in the locked position, the light will come on, but it will turn off immediately, so no big issue there either. So at the end of the day, I think the selector switch is completely adequate for this particular tool, and I don't really have any complaints. Okay, next up we have the belt clip. Now the belt clip itself is made out of metal and is fairly rigid. I definitely think it's going to hold up just fine, but unfortunately it can only be mounted on the left side of the tool, which means you can really only hang the tool on your, right hip. So there is a little bit of a downside there. I personally would have liked to have seen a, double-sided belt clip, but we did not get that on this particular tool. So a little bit of a bummer there. But for the most part, the belt clip will keep the tool located on your hip, whether you have it on your pocket, on your secondary pocket, or on your belt, or whatever else you might be trying to hang it on. It should stay in place just fine unless you really rub it against something hard or are running down the side of the road. It's not going to stay in place at that point. But very few belt clips will keep it in place at that point. So at the end of the day, I'm fairly happy with the overall design of the belt clip. I just wish that you could mount it on, say, the left side of your body rather than being forced to only mount it on the right side of your body. So just something to keep in mind if you are considering buying this particular tool. And next up we have, glory be, a super magnet tray, or a super magnet located on the top of the drill. 10 out of 10, just kidding. I'm not going to give it 10 out of 10 because while I am a huge fan of having a magnet on the tool, and I definitely think this is a worthy upgrade, they didn't make it near big enough, or add a second one that would have been even more useful. But I am super happy that we got a magnet tray because it can be super useful for storing extra bits or screws when you are working on a project. Now you can only really store 1 or 2 large screws on this particular magnet or a single bit, but it's definitely a useful feature and I'm super stoked that they decided to go this route. The only thing I would change would be to make it bigger, and the fact that they went with a super magnet means that they actually have listened to somebody in the design department somewhere, because, the super magnet is going to do a far better job at retaining whatever you put on there than those weak magnets that they were putting on the Ryobi tools near the end. So at the end of the day, I'm super stoked to see this particular feature, and I'm very happy that they went with this particular magnet. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the LED light. Now the LED light is located directly above the trigger and will become activated when you pull the trigger. As soon as you release the trigger, the light will turn off, and that's about the, rundown on that. It's a fairly concentrated light, although it's not the brightest in the world. Since it's so well concentrated, it does a fairly good job at illuminating the area directly in front of the drill. As a matter of fact, I actually prefer it over the compact Ryobi drill, which is literally 5 times the price as the Hyper-Tough drill, because of its ability to illuminate a tighter area. The Ryobi does have a slightly brighter light, but it's spread out, or it's distributed much more widely than the Hyper-Tough, and so it actually looks darker. But when it comes down to an actual work scenario, I would much rather have the more concentrated LED light on the Hyper-Tough because I can actually see what I'm working on in that case. So at the end of the day, it really does come down to your own personal preference, but for me personally, I would rather have the light on the Hyper-Tough drill than the one on the Ryobi drill, which is somewhat disappointing. But with that being said, it will be up to you and your own personal preferences. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the clutch. Now the clutch on this particular drill is made out of plastic and is fairly easy to turn. I personally would have preferred the ridges on the clutch to be a little bit taller, so it would have been a little bit easier to grasp, but it's not horrible and it's still workable. Now there are 18 different positions plus the drilling position, and that gives you quite a bit of room to work with, but it's definitely not going to be the best on the market for assembling and disassembling more delicate objects. For me personally, I've been using the Hyper-Tough 8-volt drill that they've discontinued, and that works fantastic for my own personal needs. But if I was to recommend getting something for assembly and disassembly of smaller electronics or power tools, or just things that have more delicate fastener posts or have a very weak plastic, I would highly recommend looking for an 8-volt clutched screwdriver or drill versus a 12-volt one, because there's just enough of a power difference there that it actually really matters. But for all your basic drill needs that don't require, you know, a more delicate touch, this particular drill will handle most of them just fine. Now, this is still a budget lightweight 12-volt drill, so it's not going to be able to, well, you know, use a massive hole saw or anything like that. But for a lot of different size drill bits, this thing will still work fairly decently, as long as, you know, it's a standard twist bit. So at the end of the day, I am fairly happy with the clutch on this particular tool considering the price point, but for more delicate jobs, I would highly recommend getting something with a little bit less power than 12 volts. Okay, last but not least, we have the chuck, and unfortunately, it's not going to be the best showing in the world. It is a 3/8" chuck with the externals made out of plastic. Now, I really don't have anything against a properly well-designed plastic chuck. I think they work okay, and I've never really had a major issue with them since the internals are still made out of metal. My issue with this particular chuck, however, is the fact that the plastic is very, very smooth. There are small indentations that are around the entire circumference of the chuck, but it just doesn't allow you to get great purchase on the chuck. And so if you really need to tighten down on a drilling bit or a driving bit, it can be rather difficult. And I would highly recommend using a pair of gloves that have a good grippy surface on them in order to maximize, well, the tightening capacity of this chuck. But as it stands, there just isn't a whole lot of room in order for you to grasp on either the portion you hold on to or the part that you spin around to loosen or tighten. So at the end of the day, this definitely could use some improvements, and I really would have preferred a design where it has taller ridges that are closely spaced together over this smooth, I don't know, crappy design that we went with here. And I think that's actually what they have on the more expensive 12-volt Hyper-Tough drill, so maybe they're just trying to push you to buy the more expensive one. Oh, and one other thing to keep in mind, there is no ratcheting function when it comes to this particular chuck, so getting those drill bits in there as tight as possible is going to be your only hope at, well, bit retention when it comes to the overall operation of this particular tool, which is a little bit disappointing, but considering the price point, it's to be expected. Moving on. Okay, without a battery, the drill weighs 816 grams, which is about 1.7 pounds. And with the included 1.5 amp hour battery, it weighs 995 grams, which is 2.2 pounds. Okay, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about this particular drill in use. And I have to say, it does a fairly decent job for a budget 12-volt drill. But that's exactly what it is, a budget 12-volt drill. I definitely found the included 1.5 amp hour battery a little bit on the weak side, and it definitely performed much better when I inserted the 4 amp hour battery that I purchased separately. Now, with that being said, this thing does handle twist bits just fine up to about, you know, a half-inch twist bit, but anything larger than that, and it definitely starts to bog down. And spade bits and hole saws are strictly out of the question for this particular tool. So as long as you keep those things in mind, you should be fairly happy with the performance that this drill is able to provide. So yeah, that's about the sum of this particular drill in use. Nothing too exciting or, you know, amazing, but it can definitely drive in your standard deck screws or drywall screws into wood without having to pre-drill holes. But if you are any sort of a stickler for actual construction practices, pre-drilling those holes will definitely benefit you. So yeah, at the end of the day, it's got an acceptable performance at an acceptable price. Moving on to the pros and cons. Okay, the first pro is price. Coming in at $20 means that this is one of the most affordable drills that you'll be able to find in a brick and mortar store, which is a pro in my opinion. Belt clip. Even though you can only mount the belt clip on one side, the fact that it's included already beats out several more expensive drills that I have purchased in the past, and so that makes it a pro in my opinion. Magnet. If you know anything about me, you'll know I really do like having magnets on my tools, and the fact they went with a neodymium magnet means that it's going to be great for holding onto those fasteners or drill bits when you need to, well, switch in between. So this is a pro in my opinion. Build quality. For $20, the build quality on this particular tool is quite good, and so this is a pro in my opinion. LED light. The LED light on this particular tool is fairly well designed, and considering the price point, it's just nice to have it. Battery included. The battery that's included may not be the best in the world, but at least it comes with one, which means that you won't need to purchase one separately, which is a pro in my opinion. And the first meh and only meh would be the grip. Overall, the grip on this particular tool just isn't going to be my favorite. It's a little bit too wide, and the motor housing is angled a little bit too high. But it's not really that big of a deal, and it really comes down to more of a personal preference thing. And the first con would be the trigger. It just isn't going to be the best trigger. There's definitely better triggers out there on the market, but for $20, it's completely acceptable. It just isn't the best. And the next con, and biggest con in my opinion, would be the smooth chuck. Overall, I'm just not a big fan of the chuck on this particular tool, and I definitely think there are better designs out there that they could have went with. And the last con would be one gear. There are no second gears, so what you get is, well, what you see when you pull that trigger. So quite frankly, it is a little bit disappointing that there's no second gear, but considering the price point, it is to be expected. And that is it for the pros and cons. Final thoughts on this particular drill. Overall, I was really liking this particular drill, and I thought it was an excellent value, right up until they released their new 20-volt brushless drill for $30. Which I think is going to be a far superior tool to this particular tool, and I think that's going to be the better value. But if you have limited space and you need a small compact 12-volt drill, this is going to be an excellent option to consider. I think the build quality on it is excellent considering the price point, and I didn't really find too many things that I absolutely hated other than the chuck on this particular drill, and there are workarounds for that particular problem. So as long as you know what you're getting into, this drill comes recommended. As long as you don't need to just spend that extra $10 and get a far better drill from the same brand. But with that being said, let's just go ahead and end this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. God bless.